Predict, pick, and prevail in your fantasy football leagues with Nick Giacobbe and Nick Kap. From breakouts to busts, superstars to sleepers, these are the guys that will help you achieve fantasy glory. This is the PrimeTime Fantasy Podcast.
Welcome everybody to Season 4, Episode 14 of the PrimeTime Fantasy Football Podcast, where we give you our predictions, our picks, with the hopes that we help you prevail throughout Week 2 and the rest of the 2024 fantasy football season. I'm your host, Nick Giacobbe, normally joined by my co-host, Nick Kap. Nick will be joining the show later today, as basically we're recording at two separate times. We have lives and we have scheduling conflicts, but instead of canceling the show entirely, we wanted to make sure that we got all the fantasy content that you normally get on our Thursday/Friday show, which is our all boom and all bust teams. So, going to be a little bit different. I'm doing this intro, then I'm going to kick it to Nick Kap, who's going to give you his all boom team. Then we're going to kick it back to me for my all boom team. Then back to Nick Kap for his all bust team, and then back to me for my all bust team. So you're still going to get 14 total players, booms and busts, to help you with those lineup decisions. If this is your first time listening or watching the show, thank you so much. This is not normally how the show goes, but again, scheduling conflicts do arise, and we're making the best of it. So you're still going to get the normal show that you normally would get later on in the week, but again, we'll be recording separately, but you'll still hear our takes in this show. If you're a first-time listener, thank you so much. You can find the show on YouTube and all audio streaming platforms. You can also find us on all social media platforms. We do a live show every Sunday, 8:30 a.m. Eastern Time. We'll be doing that this week as well for Week 2 to get all of your fantasy football questions answered. Flex plays, injuries, boom busts, whatever questions you guys have that are fantasy related, we want to help you out. 8:30 a.m. Eastern Time, before NFL Network, before ESPN. We're up bright and early with you guys, and we'd love to answer your fantasy football questions. That show is on YouTube, Facebook, and Instagram. The best place to go to is YouTube. You'll see your comments in the stream, and you'll know how far you are in the queue. And you'll also see the other comments get brought up on the screen. So YouTube, Facebook, and Instagram. Hope to talk to you guys about that on Sunday. For now, we're going to kick it to Nick Kap for his all boom team for Week 2.
Thanks, Nick, for the intro. And here we go with our all boom team. Kicking it off, rookie quarterback, second game of his career after that star-studded performance in Week 1. We're going with Jayden Daniels. QB3 on the week, 27 points in his debut, 16 rushing attempts, 88 yards, 2 touchdowns. I mean, what more do you want from a rookie quarterback in an all-boom purpose? You get the safe floor of the rushing attempts and his passing concerns. I didn't think he had too many. 17 of 24, pretty efficient. And now he gets to go up against the New York Giants. And the New York Giants last week let Sam Darnold, who statistically has been the worst quarterback since 2018, look like prime Aaron Rodgers, my guy from the Jets. Maybe he didn't look like prime Aaron Rodgers on Monday, but you know what? Sam Darnold did. And I think Jayden Daniels, with this talented receiving core, is going to light them on fire in the passing game. And clearly that rushing game gives him such a safe floor with high upside. I'm already ready to slot him into my lineups over your Joe Burrows, your Dak Prescotts, some of those fringe guys. If you were missing Jordan Love and you had Jayden Daniels, you're in the perfect situation to make up for it. Sending it over to my RB1 for my all boom team, we're going with Jerome Ford. One of those guys that if you're in zero RB, I think worked out really well. And last week, it wasn't the greatest production, but I saw a lot of things and a lot of numbers that point in the right direction. He quietly, out of all the running backs, had some of the best usage in Week 1. He was on the field 75% of the time. He got 12 of the team's 14 carries in a game that did not favor running the ball. He had the most routes run of any running back in Week 1. He had 37 total. That's ridiculous for a lot of receivers. And for a running back to get that, that's great. Now you go up against the Jacksonville Jaguars, who last week, Devon Achane, 7 catches, 76 yards. Jerome Ford running that many routes. Not saying he's going for 7 for 76, but the opportunity is there. And no, he's not the explosive player that Achane is. But given the guaranteed workload, the snap share that he was given, all the routes run, he's a safe floor with high upside. If he finds the end zone, he's going to find his way into the top 12 in this situation, in this matchup. Next, we're going up against the grain. We're going Rachaad White. And I know the Lions defense has been stout against running backs, and Kyren Williams didn't look great, but Rachaad White did look really good last week. 15 rushing attempts and 6 targets, 100 all-purpose yards. Again, Lions, tough matchup, but Kyren Williams last week ran the second most routes of any running back, and Rachaad White is a PPR machine. He gets a ton of those short catches that add up for your fantasy team very, very quickly. If Rachaad White's going to run a lot of routes against the Lions in a game that will be high scoring, one of the highest over-unders of the week, I think Rachaad White offers a very safe floor, and I would not be scared of the Lions matchup, who, yes, they did some stuff to Kyren Williams and didn't give him the explosive week that you would have hoped for in week 1, but was a safe floor play with some ceiling. Rachaad White in this matchup offers the same exact thing. Heading over to the wide receiver 1, I'm going with Devontae Smith. Last week, he was absolutely great. I talked about it on our recap when we gave our 5 best feedback and takeaways from the Sunday night slate and from the week 1 of football. He finished inside the top 20 after everything was said and done from Monday night. Now he gets the extended rest after the trip to Brazil. And in week 1, we kind of understated how much usage he got and how great he really was. He outsnapped A.J. Brown. They had similar targets. I think one had one more reception. One had 8, one had 9. Either way, both phenomenal. A.J. Brown found the end zone, which gave him the top 10 week. Here's what I will say about Devontae Smith and why I love him this year and why I'm ready to buy into him and buy high. I'm willing to trade some of those Chris Olaves and Drake Londons where people are willing to speculate now for a Devontae Smith. I know you took him in the second round, but this is the type of trade that can win you the league. He had the highest percentage of snaps from the slot this past week, which was the most he had in his entire career with Kellen Moore. And we don't understate how great of a fantasy offensive coordinator that Kellen Moore is. He produced elite numbers for Keenan Allen and CeeDee Lamb. And for both of them, they had their highest usage in the slot. Keenan Allen, in his 8, 9, 10-year career, however many years he's been in the league this year, had his best fantasy season on a per-game basis, running routes from the slot last year with Kellen Moore. Devontae Smith is going to get that opportunity. And all of this happened with Jalen Hurts having an under-average game and turning the ball over 3 total times. That's not going to be the case and not going to be a weekly thing from Hurts. You can expect this team to constantly be high scoring. And again, high over-unders. Those are the kind of matchups we want from our maybe you start him, maybe you bench him guys going up against the Atlanta Falcons and that defense who, yes, look good against the Steelers, but the Steelers is not the Philadelphia Eagles offense. I think that it's going to be a great game for Devontae Smith, and I think he is a must start the rest of the season, but I think he has all boom potential in this matchup. Next, I'm calling my shot on my rookie wide receiver, a guy that I loved going into the season, and I loved what I saw in week 1, and I think he's going to continue to take steps forward. I'm going with Brian Thomas Jr. Again, loved the talent. Loved it going into the season. Love what I saw. He outsnapped Christian Kirk in week 1. Christian Kirk was the wide receiver number 1 for this team 2 years ago and was great. I had him on my all boom team last week, but Brian Thomas Jr. outsnapped him and got that workload. So now I'm ready to lock in Brian Thomas to my lineup. I'm not going to mention that Gabe Davis outsnapped him. I did mention it, but Gabe Davis, we know the player. He's so hit or miss. He's that downfield threat. Brian Thomas Jr. is that elite guy. On top of that, even though he outsnapped Christian Kirk, the Jags only had 53 offensive snaps last year. Just for some perspective, the Seattle Seahawks had the least amount of plays per game last year at 58. So the Jags had a horrible amount of offensive snaps, and it's not going to be that low. You can expect that to balance out, get higher, get more reps, which is more upside for more points. Now you get to face the Cleveland Browns, whose offense kept putting the Cowboys in scoring position because they could not move the ball. The Jags defense did a similar thing to the Miami Dolphins. The Tyreek touchdown, the 80-yard one, is what made the difference in that team having an elite game and not an elite game. If that does not happen, which it could very much happen with these guys, love them, it's going to be a guns blazing game for Brian Thomas, Gabe Davis, Christian Kirk, some of those guys. And the field position, the game script, it might not be as high of an over-under game, but the talent's there. The snap share is there. The workload is going to be there. I'm all in on Brian Thomas Jr. This week, every week, I'm ready to lock him into my flex spot. But this is another one of those great matchups and great situations based off what we see on the other side of the ball. Tight end, we're going Colby Parkinson. Kind of one of those fringe guys. Picked him up off the waivers. If you're missing Njoku, Jake Ferguson, I really like Colby Parkinson and what I saw, the amount of reps and the opportunity. And listen, none of the tight ends played great last week. I'm not saying play him over one of those guys that you put that elite draft capital into, but I am saying those fringe tight ends, from a workload, from a snap share perspective, Colby Parkinson did really well. Puka going onto the IR in week 1, and then Colby Parkinson had 5 targets, which is solid for a tight end, especially when you get off the waivers. But he ran the most routes of any tight end this fantasy week. So he's getting the opportunity. He's getting the snap share. There's no competition there with Higbee out. So it's a great opportunity for him on what I called the second best offense for fantasy football going into the season. I still believe that even without Puka Nacua. I love Tyler Johnson. I love Demarcus Robinson. I love Colby Parkinson. I actually had Tyler Johnson on the all boom team and then made the switch to the flex, which we'll get to shortly. But the Rams and Cardinals, again, another high over-under game. I believe it's in the high 40s, low 50s, which, again, one of the highest over-unders. Those are the kind of matchups you really want. And yes, Dalton Kincaid did struggle against the Cardinals, but a big part of that is that Dalton Kincaid was literally quadruple teamed. I mean, there's literally clips going around Twitter. You could take a look for yourself. I don't have them on me right now. Of him having 4 linebacker safeties surrounding him on the field. And that's because the Buffalo Bills do not have the wide receiver outside talent that the Rams do. Cooper Kupp, Demarcus Robinson, Tyler Johnson, 2 speed guys, Cooper Kupp in the slot. That's going to open up the middle of the field for Colby Parkinson and in the flat routes. It's going to be a good opportunity for a fringe tight end who I'm not saying he's going to finish top 5 over the course of the season, but without Puka here, there's a tremendous opportunity for a waiver tight end very early on. And lastly, going into my flex, we're going with J.K. Dobbins. I was all over J.K. Dobbins this offseason, and it paid off big in week 1. I actually ran him in a DFS lineup at his value, and his value has doubled in DFS since. So can't get him there as cheaply as you did. But, man, Jim Harbaugh just loves to run the ball. And since Monday, J.K. Dobbins has been the talk of the town. He's going on shows like The Herd and praising him. You see Aaron Rodgers praising him. Like, the kid is really good and explosive, and he just got put behind one of the best offensive lines in football. You have your guy, I saw this great nickname for him, Control Alt Delete, as in Joe Alt, and he absolutely shut down Max Crosby in week 1. In the preseason, the Chargers had the most yards before contact for any running back in football. And yes, it's preseason. We don't want to take too much away from it, but it just shows that this Chargers offense and their defense, frankly, are much better with Jim Harbaugh than they were with Brandon Staley. And now you go up against the Panthers, which is the best game script for any team in football, honestly. And this Chargers team is physical. They're going to go up early, and Jim Harbaugh is not going to sway from running the ball, and it is going to be the J.K. Dobbins and maybe even the Gus Edwards show. So checking a lot of boxes. Love it for fantasy. I'm now going to send it back to Nick to give you his all boom team.
All right. Thank you, Nick, for that. We're now going to talk about my all boom team for week 2. I did throw a lot of darts at the board. I do have a lot of information to back up my booms and busts, but there is a lot to talk about. And maybe I'm doing some hot takes. Maybe I'm reaching, but that's part of the fun with fantasy football. So for my quarterback, I have Justin Fields. And Justin Fields is a quarterback last week who probably wasn't supposed to start this time last week. We all thought it would be Russell Wilson. It ended up being Justin Fields. And Justin Fields ended up being the quarterback 19 on the week. He scored 11.9 fantasy points against a pretty stingy Atlanta Falcons defense. There were no touchdowns scored in that game. I know they had red zone opportunities, but no touchdowns were scored in that game, unfortunately, for Justin Fields. But I see that changing. Fields is going up against the Broncos defense, just allowed 11.8 points to Geno Smith in week 1. Geno was the quarterback 7 on the week. The Broncos last year allowed the 11th most points to quarterbacks in 2023, a 17.7 average. It's also a good spot if you had Jordan Love. Let's throw Justin Fields in there. You probably didn't have a lot of quarterbacks on your waiver wire. Maybe you went and picked up Justin Fields. This is a good opportunity to play that backup that you just put on your team. Justin Fields had 14 rushing opportunities last week. It sounds like Coach Tomlin is all in on Justin Fields. It doesn't even sound like Russell Wilson's going to get an opportunity to start anytime soon. So with that said, they're all in on Fields. He has the rushing upside. Last season, I just want to pull up the stat right here just to make sure. So last season, Justin Fields, I believe he was a top 10 quarterback if my notes want to load. So in a down year, Justin Fields, his average was top 10. His average was 18.4. And he averaged out to about a top 10 quarterback. He missed a lot of games due to injury, but still, Fields is reliable, and I think you could plug him in here with your offense. My first running back I have for my all-boom team, and it's rare that I do a guy who's a star and put him on an all-boom team, but I'm going to go with Jonathan Taylor here because it's a guy that I see a lot of people doubting, and I'm a Taylor owner in 2 leagues, including my Dynasty League, and I'm a bit worried about Taylor. Anthony Richardson's rushing upside does not help Taylor. It only hurts him, and Taylor didn't have any receptions with week 1. So why am I booming him? That's because he's facing the Packers defense. That Packers defense just allowed 33.2 points in PPR leagues to Saquon Barkley in week 1. And that's the most points any defense is allowed to a running back throughout week 1 at least. But last year, the Packers also allowed the 12th most fantasy points to running backs, an average of 20.4 points to backs on a weekly basis. There will be no Jordan Love that I just spoke about. So the Colts are going to be up in this game. At least I think so. I don't think Malik Willis is going to be lighting it up for the Packers. I can see the Packers losing by double digits. That's a lot of opportunities for the Colts to run the ball with a safe lead and a real opportunity to get Jonathan Taylor going. If the Colts are going to be successful this season, they really can't rely on Anthony Richardson's arm for the entirety of the season. They need to play defense and run the football. And it's the perfect opportunity to really get Taylor into his groove. My second running back, I have Ramondre Stevenson. That's a guy that I doubted going into the season. I wanted no shares of him. I wanted no shares of the Patriots back, but he's a true bell cow. He had over 20 rushing opportunities in week 1. He scored 21.6 points in PPR leagues. He was the running back 7 on the week against the Bengals defense that a lot of people played thinking that was good defensive play. Stevenson now goes up against the Seahawks defense, who many people are really giving credit to Mike McDonald, and you should. He really got those boys, those boys running. I'm a Seahawks guy. I love the tackling performance. However, last year, the Seahawks allowed the 3rd most points to running backs, an average of 25.7 points. They also allowed 21 rushing touchdowns to running backs. The weakest part of that Seahawks defense is the linebacker room, losing Bobby Wagner, a huge loss for them, also losing Jordan Brooks. So the middle linebacker core is not the strength of that defense. It's really the secondary. So should be a lot of opportunities for Stevenson to really gobble up some points. On to the receivers. The first receiver I have here is Drake London, a guy that a lot of people drafted high and were kind of worried about drafting high. And he threw up a major stink bomb on week 1. He put up less than 10 fantasy points. That entire Falcons offense really threw up a stink bomb. Besides Kyle Pitts, and Bijan Robinson also had like 15 points. However, Drake London is now going up against the Eagles defense. That Eagles defense is not good against wide receivers. Last year, they allowed the most points to wideouts in 2023, a 36.6 average allowed to wide receivers. Just last week, they allowed the wide receiver 1 for the Packers. At least we think it's the wide receiver 1, Jaden Reed, to score 33.1 points. He was the wide receiver 1 on the week in PPR leagues. On top of all of that, London's a perimeter receiver. He's not going to really play the slot too much. The Eagles defense also allowed the 2nd most in 2023. This is the perfect get-right game for Drake London and that Falcons offense. My second receiver, I have a guy that I'm also not high on. A lot of guys I'm not high on the all-boom team here. Brandon Ayuk. The 49ers offense is just so hard to kind of project from McCaffrey or Mason, and then there's obviously Ayuk and Debo and Kittle. It's hard to predict who's going to get theirs. And on Monday night, it was really Mason and Debo. I think this will be the Ayuk game. He had to kind of shake off some rust, wasn't at camp, didn't really get to form that chemistry with Purdy going into the season. I think he shook off that rust, and now he's going up against a Vikings defense who, again, was very bad last year. Last year, they allowed the 6th most points to wide receivers, an average of 30.8. They also allowed 17 touchdowns to the receiving position. Last week, the Vikings allowed 2 Giants receivers to not notch in the top 32, even though I don't think the Giants scored an offensive touchdown last week. Both Wan'Dale Robinson and Malik Neighbors are top 32 receivers. I think Brandon Ayuk ends up being a top 15 wide receiver this week, maybe even cracking the top 10 if he does receive the volume that I think he can receive. My tight end for your all boom team. The thing is, all your top tight ends that did not boom last week, the Kelseys, the Laportas, the Andrews, they all have really good matchups this week. So I think all the top tight ends can boom. So I didn't want to give you a top tight end. I wanted to give you a sleeper kind of. So I'm going with Dallas Goedert. And I just stated that the Eagles will be playing the Falcons. Well, the Falcons were really bad against tight ends in 2023. They allowed the 10th most fantasy points to tight ends in 2023, an average of 10.5. The Falcons also just allowed 6.7 points to Pat Freiermuth, who was the tight end 13 last week. 6.7 is nothing to write home about, but the Steelers didn't score an offensive touchdown. If that touchdown went to Freiermuth, that's a 12.7 point day. I also think the Eagles will score a lot of points. I think they're the best offense in the league. Me and Nick spoke about that in one of our shows during the offseason, our top 5 offenses for fantasy. We had the Eagles ranked at number 1. So with the Eagles throwing a lot, with the Eagles getting a lot of scoring opportunities, I think this is a great opportunity for Dallas Goedert to get in the end zone, maybe get a couple receptions, like 50, 60 yards. I think he could crack about 12 to 15 fantasy points. Lastly, my flex play is going to be Terry McLaurin, a guy that I loved going into this offseason or going into this season. I loved his ADP. He was going in around 7 or 8. That's a wide receiver 1 that's had 1,000 yards in 3 of his last 4 seasons. He put up a stinker in week 1, and that's because Jaden Daniels really wasn't throwing a lot. But now he's going up against a New York Giants defense that in 2023 allowed the 5th most fantasy points to wide receivers, an average of 31.6 per game. Last week, the Giants allowed 15.9 points to Justin Jefferson. He was the wide receiver 15. It's the wide receiver 1 for the Minnesota Vikings. The coaches also came out this week and said that they want Jaden Daniels to throw more. This is a great opportunity for Jaden Daniels against a bad defense. A good opportunity for a lot of Commanders players. So Daniels should be locked to your lineup. So should Terry. So should Brian Robinson. This is a really good game for all those Commanders players to really kind of hit their groove with the rookie quarterback. And I'm going to lock Terry into my flex spots. We're now going to kick it to Nick Kap for his all bust team for week 2.
All right, Nick, thank you. Getting into the all bust team. I've been critical of him. I wish we were both recording live together. Joe Burrow sucked in week 1. Now you get an even worse situation. The New England Patriots was the best case scenario for you for fantasy. One of the best matchups you could have had. Yes, there's the Panthers and the Giants. Yeah, they're great. The New England Patriots should have been a top 5 matchup for you, and they were not. Now you get to go up against your arch rival, the Kansas City Chiefs. And yes, Joe Burrow tends to play up to his talent, but I am not trusting Joe Burrow in my lineup against Steve Spagnuolo off a long rest week. We understated how valuable the rest of the pieces were for this Bengals team. Brian Callahan, you lose him in the offseason. You can make fun of the Titans all you want and Will Levis. That offense looks so much more creative than the Bengals did this week. And the Bengals offense has looked very creative for years. Brian Callahan, offensive coordinator, leaves the team, head coach Tennessee. Levis doesn't turn those balls over. We're talking about Brian Callahan in a totally different light this week. You replace Joe Mixon, who looked like one of the best running backs in football, with Zach Moss on his 3rd team in 5 years. You lose Tyler Boyd, who might not be a superstar, but was a great wide receiver 3, one of the best in football, and can step in when T. Higgins and Jamar Chase are out. And now, again, reported T. Higgins not practicing. Jamar Chase, contract disputes, just turned down 4 years, $140 million, which would have tied him as the highest paid receiver in football. And you got these 2 guys that were missing training camp with these contract disputes. You're not getting that chemistry early on after Joe Burrow had the injury-riddled season. It does not look good. And when you have these guys out, who's the number 2? It's a big question mark. And unfortunately, I don't think they have that option. And I think the Kansas City Chiefs defense looked great in week 1. Again, I think the Bengals will turn the season around. But week 2, Steve Spagnuolo, 10 days rest because of a Thursday night week 1 opener. It is a horrible situation. The Bengals are going to start out 0-2. and Joe Burrow is not going to be Joe Burrow, whatever you want to call him, for all the swag that you think he has. Running back bust. Zamir White. I'm surprised he ended up on this list this early. But listen, man, Alexander Madison got a lot more usage than we thought. He outsnapped White 36-23. He even with Zamir White's 10 carries, he wasn't efficient enough. And the Chargers defense, they're not elite. They were awful last year to running backs. They were allowed top 5 most points per game to the running back position. And they absolutely shut Zamir White down. And yes, I talked about Jim Harbaugh and him turning this team around. It should not have jumped that much for a guy like Zamir White, who, when he stepped in for Josh Jacobs last year, was pretty decent. And he's not going to get a lot of work in the passing game because Gardner Minshew has that mobility, and there's enough receiving safety blankets like your Brock Bowers, your Devontae Adams, where it's quick reads. They're not extending plays. That's like not going to happen with this Raiders team. So you're not going to get those checkdowns. It's going to be design catches, if anything. And I really don't love it. I think Alexander Madison was the more talented back. It was clear, and the team clearly saw it. Madison ran 14 more routes. So he's kind of got to stay on your bench. And I hate to say it, because if you went 0 RB, and it's a strategy I've been praising all offseason, you kind of expected him to be a safe option with that guaranteed workload, but he's just not that. And unfortunately, it does not look like this situation is improving this week, next week. He's got to ride your bench for a little bit, and there's a shot 2 to 3 weeks from now he's on your waiver wire, and it would be totally justified because Alexander Madison just was the better back. RB2 for the all the bust team, apologies, Javonte Williams, and I'm willing to slam the panic button after week 1. He only had a 52% snap share. You don't love it unless it's an elite offense. He only had 2 targets with a quarterback who only checks down. It was Jaleel McLaughlin who was getting a lot of that usage in the passing game, not him. McLaughlin did outsnap him on the early downs, which meant Javonte Williams really a third down back. And yes, he did get in a little bit more for the snap share, but he had that workload beaten into a lot more than I think most of us thought he would. And listen, the Broncos got a ton of offensive snaps in this game. They kept putting the Seahawks in bad positions. I think the Seahawks got safety twice. I know at least once in the game. So when you're only getting 8 carries and 2 targets, with one of the most amount of snaps ran on offense in football, that's a bad situation. That's the coach saying you're just not talented enough to be out on this field. And I think Jaleel McLaughlin's going to lap him by the end of the season. I don't think that he is going to be he'll be on rosters because he's got some name value, but he's not going to be talented enough to break into your starting lineup. Kind of same thing with Zamir White. If you went that 0 running back lineup, I really hope you got J.K. Dobbins or Jerome Ford. I really like those 2 guys a lot better than I like Javonte or Zamir White. Next, wide receiver 1. I swear to God, I do not hate him. I had him on the all bust team last week. It's George Pickens. And the talent is clearly there. But the fact is he's going into one of the worst matchups in football, Patrick Surtain. Pat Surtain, Sauce Gardner, 2 best corners, absolutely shut down receiver 1s. We saw it with Ayuk last week. We saw it with DK Metcalf last week. So George Pickens not going to do well against a true shadow corner in Patrick Surtain, not unless you have pinpoint accuracy. And it's trending towards Justin Fields playing. I do not like that for him. And if it's Russell Wilson, I also don't like it for him. I think Russ might be a little bit better of a situation for the passing game because he's not going to run and take off like Fields will as much. But to me, against a shadow corner and one of the 2 to 3 best in football, I do not love the matchup. And I think George Pickens deserves a spot on the bench until he gets some of these easier matchups. And they're just not going to happen too often in this division. So on Sunday's podcast, the live show, definitely go check it out. Ask all your start-sit questions. Give us your predictions for the week. We'd love to respond, interact with you guys, 8:30 a.m. Eastern Standard Time before all your shows. I said that I was coming around on Stephon Diggs, and he got 2 touchdowns in the red zone, but that's not why I expected Stephon Diggs to turn his season around or like his projection around. He was falling in all of my drafts. But I said, this guy's been an 1,000-yard receiver for so long. He's been an elite talent. He's going to another great quarterback that we project to do well. He should be good. My problem is, in saying that, I thought the workload would be better, and it just wasn't. He only got 6 targets in the games, and he caught all 6. Good for him. And the 2 touchdowns saved the week. But if I told you he went 6 catches for 33 yards and didn't find the end zone, you would never start that player in fantasy. Like that guy would not exist in your lineup, especially when you have 3 elite pass catchers and Joe Mixon, who was a top 5 running back in week 1. Then you go up against the Bears defense, who I hate to tell people is probably one of the best in football. Ever since last year when they made the trade for, I think it was Montez Sweat, that defensive line stepped up. The Bears defense was top 10 from trade deadline on. And now they looked great in week 1. Again, I said it earlier, Brian Callahan, very creative offensive coach. They could not move the ball. And Will Levis was a big problem with that. Don't get me wrong. But the Bears defense locked them up pretty well. And I expect them to do a lot of the same exact thing this week towards some of those receivers. I think you're going to have to rely on your bigger, taller, more athletic Nico Collins and your young speedster and Tank Dell. I think that that's kind of what you're going to see. You're not going to see Stephon Diggs, who had the lowest depth of target in week 1 with, of any receiver with 5+ catches, really be that dominant. I think Diggs is going to have very good weeks, and you might need to play him because the talent's there, the name's there, the offense is elite, makes a lot of sense, checks a lot of boxes. I'm just saying I don't think this is the week for Stephon Diggs. I think it's more the Tank Dell, Nico Collins outlook. Going to the tight end, I'm picking on, I already picked on Pickens. I'm picking on his partner in crime, Pat Freiermuth. Justin Fields and Russell Wilson never produced great tight end numbers for anybody in their career. Cole Kmet, maybe you could say at some time, but not really. And then Russ a whole century ago with Jimmy Grandpa, but that's just not the case with Pat Freiermuth. I don't think he's the talent. I know they gave him a bag, but this isn't the situation. Like I mentioned earlier, Justin Fields trending towards playing. Pat Freiermuth, really a middle of the field threat. Justin Fields, 23 pass attempts. Not a single one went to the middle of the field. Like, seriously, you could go look up the chart of where he threw it. It was left side flat, right side flat, and deep down the field. Like, that's the only places he looked, which worked for him. But rather than throw to the middle, Justin Fields just likes to take off down the middle and use that guy as a blocker. So that's not going to be a good situation. Then you have the Broncos, who are pretty good at covering the tight end position. Not one of the better in the game in football, but still pretty good. Then you go, and this is what I always like to look at with tight end, and I like to look at it for a lot of my players, is the over-under. And this is one of the lowest in the week. This awful Broncos offense versus this awful Steelers offense, and both these guys have pretty good defenses. So if I'm going to risk my week and I want the upside of a good tight end, I prefer the better offense and the higher over-under, the better matchup. And if you roster Pat Freiermuth, this is exactly where I mentioned I'd rather have Colby Parkinson in his matchup with a high over-under, a lead offense, better quarterback, more opportunity because of the Puka Nacua injury than a guy like Pat Freiermuth, who, yes, is talented, did get paid a bag, but the situation's awful, and his quarterback's not thrown to the middle of the field. So it does not look like it's going to be a good season for Pat this year, and I would not be surprised to see him on the waiver wire soon. And lastly, flexing him out. I want to say this before I get to him. Nick and I both, the way that we do it is we have a middle source, the anonymous source. If you're a WWE lifelong fan, the anonymous GM, the computer, the guy that sees our lineups tells us, all right, you got to change these out. You got to change these out. Nick is going to get to his 7. I had 5 of them on my lineup. So I'll be honest, this one was a little bit of digging deep to find a guy that I didn't really like, because Nick got all the good ones this week. I got the all booms. He had to change any of his. I'm sure we'll see it soon in his clip. But I had to make some changes, and here was one of them. One that I don't love having him as an all bust, because I do think he's pretty good. The game script should be fine for it. I'm going DeAndre Swift. Houston absolutely locked down Jonathan Taylor last week. One of the best running backs in football, talent-wise. 16 carries, only 48 yards, and then he had the touchdown to save the week. But he did not have a single target. I think that's more of an Anthony Richardson thing. But when you have an athletic quarterback like an AR or Caleb Williams, their preference is going to be run the ball, do it themselves, don't pass it over. So to me, and that's with a much better offensive coach in Shane Steichen, who can really draw things up, dial guys in, and produce elite numbers. And unfortunately, Eberflus, he's got the defensive side of the ball down, but the offense is not there yet. It will get there. Their new offensive coordinator is a guy from the Shanahan system, and those guys, let's be honest, they tend to work out for football. Mike McDaniel, Maybe not D'Amico Ryans, not Bob Sala, but it will get better. But I don't think Caleb Williams early season. I said it. Temper the expectations for these guys. It's their first time going up in the NFL. It's week 2, and this is not a great matchup against D'Amico and those boys on defense. So I don't know if DeAndre Swift is as big of a bust as I see guys like Zamir White. But if you went for the 0 running back strategy or hero, and DeAndre Swift is one of those guys, here's a few guys I like the matchup better than, and I mentioned a few earlier: Dobbins, Ford. And if you can go with a guy like Zach Charbonnet, I love that. If you got Rachaad White, who went at a similar ADP to DeAndre Swift, love that. Brian Robinson, love it. David Montgomery, love it. Najee Harris, love it. That's a lot of guys that had good weeks and have better matchups this week. So I'd rather trust their reliability and maybe put Swift on the bench this week rather than try and throw him out there in what I don't think is going to be a great game or a great game script for DeAndre Swift. All right, we're going to kick it back to Nick now so he can give you his all bust team, and we'll see you guys on the Sunday Live.
All right, I'm now going to give you my all bust team for week 2, starting off with the quarterback. And this is kind of a hot take. I'm going to go with CJ Stroud. He was a top 10 quarterback last week. He does always have an opportunity to throw for 400 or 500 yards. So I'm not telling you to bench Stroud, but what I'm going to tell you here is temper your expectations, because I don't think he ends up being a top 10 quarterback within week 2. Going up against the Bears defense, the Bears are a really stingy defense, and they've been a little bit more favorable to quarterbacks, but they've been in the top 10 defense last season, and now they have Caleb Williams. They have an upgraded offense. This team is better overall, and the defense is going to keep this offense in games. Last week, the Bears were down 17 points, and then it was 2 turnover touchdowns, both on special teams, and I believe a pick 6 by the Bears. That made Will Levis, the quarterback, 27 last week, only scoring 8.7 points. Again, I'm not telling you to bench CJ Stroud, but if you have a better option at quarterback, if you have a guy like Baker or Stafford or Goff, I would play your backup over Stroud this week, because I'm concerned with him going up against these Bears defense on Sunday Night Football. And I think they could run the ball more. It's a defensive-minded head coach. Joe Mixon was the running back 2 last week, right behind Barkley at 170 yards, a touchdown, a couple receptions. So I think they could run the ball more. And instead of leaning on Stroud's arm, they could really try to control this game with Mixon and their defense. My first running back that I'm busting this week is Rachaad White. And I know it's tough to bust him in PPR leagues, but he's going up against the Lions defense. I told you guys last week to bust Kyren Williams. He's on my all-bust team going up against that Lions defense. And Kyren Williams only scored 14.4 points. And although it's a solid number, he needed a touchdown to get to that number. Take that touchdown away, that's only 8 fantasy points. The Lions last year were the toughest defense against fantasy running backs. They only let an average of 14 fantasy points. On top of all this, bad matchup, I think that the Bucs will throw the ball a lot more. The Lions will allow a lot of passing yards. We saw what Baker and company did last week. Rachaad White is an inefficient running back, and he has Mr. Bucky Irving breathing down his neck, who just averaged 6.9 yards per carry in week 1. I think the Bucky Irving cutting into Rachaad White's kind of role is going to happen a lot sooner than people think, and I don't want to be caught in that crossfire. I would actually try to trade Rachaad White before this week, trade him as soon as possible before the Bucky Irving breakout happens. My second running back bust is going to be Aaron Jones, who again had a very solid performance last week. I think he had 15 fantasy points. He was within the top 10. But now he faces the 49ers defense, who looked excellent on Monday night. They held Breece Hall to 18.3 fantasy points, also had a touchdown. He was running back 13 on the week. And the thing is, you drafted Breece Hall as probably your second or third running back, or I guess it was the second or third running back off the board. 18 is a really solid number. But I don't think Aaron Jones is as talented as Breece Hall, and I don't think the offense is as talented as the Jets offense. So I'm worried about Aaron Jones. I'm worried that there's not going to be a lot of running lanes. I'm worried about that the 49ers defense might just gobble up the Vikings offense alive. Last year, the 49ers were the 5th toughest defense, 2 running backs, allowing an average of 16.5 fantasy points. You probably have to play Jones as a thin position. Probably the same thing as White. Again, thin position. You probably have to play both of them, but I think they're both going to bust this week. I don't think either of them will be top 15 running backs on the week. On to wide receivers. Here's another big hot take by me. Jamar Chase is going to be a bust this week, and here's why. He only scored 12.2 fantasy points in week 1. He was a wide receiver 28. It looks like T. Higgins is also not going to be playing this week. That is going to hurt Chase because there's no other receiver that they could really trust to catch the ball. It's going to be all zeroed in on Chase. And look who he's facing, the Kansas City Chiefs defense. Against receivers last year, the Chiefs allowed the third lowest points to fantasy wide receivers at 22.2 average. Obviously, the averages are really high for PPR receivers. And the Chiefs take away your number one weapon. Look what they did to Mark Andrews last week. They doubled Mark Andrews on 90% of his snaps, only allowed 3.4 fantasy points. I think the Chiefs are going to double Chase in this game. Look what happened with the Bengals against the Patriots defense last week. They really couldn't move the ball. This is a better defense and a better offense, a better team that they're facing. I think the Bengals are in big trouble. I'm benching Burrow in both of my leagues. I could have easily had Burrow on my all bust team as well. But I think Chase, I would consider benching him. I really would. I think receiver at how deep the position is, if you have a better option, I would actually bench Jamar Chase this week. I see him finishing. He finishes wide receiver 28 last week. I think he finishes outside the top 30 this week. My second receiver, I have Christian Kirk. Christian Kirk scored 12.2 points last. He scored. I lost my train of thought. Sorry about that, guys. Christian Kirk was going up against the Browns defense, who was very tough on wide receivers last year, allowing the second lowest points to wide receivers behind the Jets at 21.8 fantasy points. Last week, they locked up CeeDee Lamb. CeeDee only scored 13.6 points. He was a wide receiver 23. And I say locked up because you're drafting CeeDee Lamb as your wide receiver 2. You're really or wide receiver 1 off the board, second overall pick off the board. You're expecting a 20-plus point performance every single week. That didn't happen because of how dominant this Browns defense is. I think this Browns defense is going to make life really tough for Trevor, for Kirk, for Evan Ingram. I think it's going to be really tough for all those guys. The Browns defense is legit. This is a better matchup for the Browns as well. The Cowboys have a better high-powered offense as the Jags don't. I think it's going to be really, really tough for the Jags to kind of move the ball and try to control this game. This might be one of the lowest scoring games of the week. And Christian Kirk is a guy I really would consider benching as well with Chase. My tight end is Brock Bowers, and I liked Bowers coming into the season. He had a really good week, especially for a rookie tight end. Rookie tight ends usually tend to struggle. Bowers did not struggle. He scored a really impressive, I think it was 11 points, tight end 3 on the week. But now he's going up against the Baltimore Ravens. Last week, the Baltimore Ravens faced Travis Kelce. They only allowed 6.4 points to Kelce, taking him out of the game in tight end 15. The Ravens defense was tougher on tight ends last year, allowing the 10th fewest points to tight ends at 8.4. I think this will be a really rough game for the Raiders. Kind of a common theme with my all-bust team. I think the Ravens defense is going to make life really, really hard on that entire Raiders offense, including Adams, including the backs, and obviously including Bowers right here. Finally, my flex play is Calvin Ridley going up against the New York Jets, who I just stated allowed the fewest points to wide receivers last year, an average of 17.4. They just allowed Deebo Samuel, he's a wide receiver 12 at 18.7, and Brandon Ayuk at 4.8. That doesn't worry me. The 49ers offense is one of, if not the best in the league. And the Titans offense is not one of the best in the league because of that quarterback. Will Levis looked really bad week 1. He fell in my bottom 5 performances for quarterbacks. They really upgraded that offense around him with Tony Pollard, with Calvin Ridley and Hopkins, obviously, and Tyler Boyd as well. But for whatever reason, Levis couldn't get things going, and I don't see him getting anything going against the Jets. I think this could be a slaughtering. I think the Jets defense might be one of the best plays in all of fantasy football this week with the number that they're going to score. On top of that, Calvin Ridley has scored less than 10 points in 5 of his last 7 games. I'd be really weary of playing Ridley in any form or fashion. I don't care how deep your league is. I would not play Calvin Ridley this week. Thank you guys for tuning into this show. I know it was a little bit different, and we do apologize for that, but we wanted to get as much fantasy content out there for you guys. So we gave you our all booms, our all bust, so you're ready for week 2. If you still have questions for week 2, and hope you do, join us Sunday morning, 8:30 a.m. Eastern time on our YouTube, Facebook, and Instagram to answer all of your fantasy football related questions for week 2. Thank you guys again. Hope to see you there.